Welcome to Passages Pulse, where we track the heartbeat of Israel and the Middle East from a Christian perspective. In a time of confusion, division, and misinformation, we're here to help you cut through the noise with truth, clarity, and conviction. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Passages Pulse. At the time of this recording, it is 11 a.m. Eastern Time on May 21st, 2025. My name is Sebastian and I'm here with my colleague Josiah. Josiah, how are you?
I'm doing very well. How are you doing, Sebastian?
I'm doing well. I'm excited to do this again. This is our third episode. Before we get started, in the first episode, we told people a little bit about ourselves. So let's just give people one tiny little more thing about you. Tell me one more fact about you. What is one thing that people could know about you?
People could know about me or people want to know about me?
I don't know if they want to, but you can tell them.
Sure. Well, just to give the audience a bit of a heads up, I'm really enjoying doing this podcast. I'm also expecting the birth of my third child any week now. So at some point in the near future, I'm going to disappear and then come back. But don't worry, this has been a lot of fun. So I'll only be gone for a little while and then back at it.
Right. Well, I hope that your baby doesn't come during this episode. So let's get to it. All right, let me tell people one little thing about me. I'm a Real Madrid fan. So Josiah has been talking about the Chiefs. I think they're a baseball team or something. Real Madrid.
Oh, Sebastian, no. No.
Just kidding. I know
American
they're a football
football
team. I know. I'm a Taylor Swift fan. I know.
Okay, good.
I like Real Madrid. I like soccer. This year has been terrible for us. Barcelona beat us at everything, but next year we'll be back. So if you like soccer, let me know in the comments, or football, as we say. All right, let's get back to business. Today, we're going to talk about the latest updates in Gaza. What exactly is the humanitarian situation there? A lot of talk about that, about aid, food coming into Gaza. Also, we're going to talk about the prospects of a hostage deal and ceasefire. Last week, we were so rejoiced to see Eden Alexander be released, but there are around 20 living hostages left, and Israel sent a team to Doha, to Qatar to negotiate. So, what are the prospects for a hostage deal? And finally, we're going to talk about the Palestinian people's desire or willpower to replace Hamas. Is there enough willpower among the people in Gaza to replace Hamas? So let's get started. Since the beginning of the war, Israel has been accused of starving the Palestinian people, and you can tell us a little bit more about that. Before we talk about the situation today, let's contextualize. Israel, around January, right, they started a ceasefire hostage deal. We saw a lot of hostages being liberated right around when President Trump came into office. So from January until March, Josiah, during that ceasefire period, let me ask you, when was the last time that Israel allowed aid into the Strip until now? Like Israel allowed, spoiler alert, Israel allowed aid into this Strip this week. We're going to talk about that. But before that, up until March, when was the last time that Israel allowed aid?
Yeah, well, really it was March 2nd. You pinpointed it, Sebastian. That was the last day that aid was allowed in until the blockade was lifted just a few days ago. So there was a couple of months where there was effectively no humanitarian aid being delivered to the Gaza Strip as part of the intense operations that the IDF was undergoing after the collapse of the last hostage ceasefire deal.
Okay, so March 2nd was the last time that trucks were allowed in. During that period, from January to March, how many trucks came in and how many tons of food were entering to the Gaza Strip?
Yeah, so it was, I believe January 19 was the start of the ceasefire deal, the hostage ceasefire deal. So between that window and then March 2nd, when the deal sort of collapsed and the humanitarian aid stopped, there was a little over 25,000 trucks that entered the Gaza Strip. That's a lot of food.
Yeah,
a lot of
just
food.
gonna say.
And it was enough in theory to feed the Gaza Strip anywhere from 3 to 6 months. So that depends in part on sort of how much you allocate per person as far as their daily diet. but it was supposed to last several months. It created a store of food that was supposed to last for a while, which is part of the reason why Israel decided that it was okay to move forward with the blockade of humanitarian aid, is that the amount of aid that had been already allowed into the Gaza Strip was enough to last for several months.
Okay, so those are the facts. Up until March, Israel allowed 25,000 aid trucks into the strip, carrying almost 500,000 tons of food, which was supposed to last for anywhere from 3 to 6 months, depends on how much food you give out. And here's the important thing we're going to talk about right now. If the aid does not get stolen by Hamas, which is a problem, right? So the question to
Right.
you, Josiah, is: has Israel created a famine in the Gaza Strip? Is Israel starving the Palestinians in Gaza?
This is kind of wild, honestly, the rhetoric that has developed about this. And I think you have to sort of take a step back and consider the context. Where did the idea of a famine come up in the first place? I mean, how did we even get to this point where we're having this conversation about famine? It really was back in, I think it was back in 2024, I forget the exact date, but Samantha Power, who at the time was the director of the US Agency for International Development, she gave a statement to the press in which she argued that Israel had created a famine in the Gaza Strip, that there were active conditions of famine in the Gaza Strip. Now, what's interesting about this, and this was not necessarily the first time, but certainly one of the early instances of a very high profile official claiming that there was a famine in the Gaza Strip. And what it did was create a bit of a frenzy about this idea that there was an actual famine happening in the Gaza Strip. If you dig a little bit deeper, though, some things that came out afterwards were a bit concerning. For example, the fact that she based this argument or this claim on work done by an independent monitor of famine conditions that is affiliated with the UN, but works semi independently. The acronym for it is the IPC. It has a much longer name, but for short, we just call it, IPC. And what came out of that report was some more details which suggested that the famine conditions were not actually in place in Gaza. What the report argued was that it was possible for a famine to develop in Gaza if humanitarian aid was not distributed effectively, but it didn't actually argue that a famine was already occurring. Now, unfortunately, people took that report and took statements by people like this director of the US aid in order to argue that Israel had already created a famine and that it was already guilty of doing something which hadn't actually happened. And this was a pattern that unfortunately you've seen followed several times since. Even just this week, you heard statements given to BBC by a UN official called Tom Fletcher, and he made this pretty absurd claim, frankly, that 14,000 babies in Gaza were going to die in the next 48 hours.
That is crazy. I heard that too, and I was like, no way.
It's insane. And some data was collected after suggesting that the number of impressions on social media or traditional media, supposedly billions of people became aware of this statement after he made it to, I think it was BBC Radio. And so you have people all around the world assuming that 14,000 babies are going to literally die in the next 48 hours if something doesn't happen. And the reality is that that was an incredibly sensationalist and inaccurate claim, because he also was reporting a study done by the IPC, which again is this independent monitor of famine conditions. It's viewed as sort of the gold standard that the international community relies on. And what their report said was actually very different for a couple of reasons. One, it didn't specifically say that babies were at risk, but that children generally are at risk of malnutrition. The second thing is that they argued that it was severe malnutrition that was a risk, not imminent death in these young children. So that's still a very serious issue, severe malnutrition that has long-term health consequences, but it's not the same thing as saying that people are going to literally die in the next 48 hours. The last thing that the report said very differently from what this UN official argued was that this was at risk of happening sometime in the course of the next year. if humanitarian aid is not delivered effectively to the Gaza Strip. So sometime in the spring of 2026. And it just goes to show, unfortunately, there's this very clear pattern of people who will take terms like famine, which are designed to, of course, create a very, I think I would argue appropriately so, serious response. I mean, famine is a serious issue, but when you misuse that term and apply it in ways that it doesn't actually, it's not relevant, it's not an appropriate use of the term, you can create a lot of panic and distort the truth so people have a very hard time understanding what is actually happening on the ground.
Yeah, exactly. I wonder, I was thinking about this. It seems to me like maybe in the last 15 years, I've seen the usage of exaggeration to make a point. Like anybody that you don't like, you call it Nazi, right? In politics right now, we've seen a lot of people calling politicians Nazis in the Trump
Sure.
administration just because they don't like them or something. I wonder if this is a recent thing or like I wonder if people want to comment. Like, is that something that's been happening a lot in the last 10 years in politics in general, or is this something that has been going on around? Because, like you just said, when you take words like genocide, or in this case, famine, and you just throw it around, it cheapens the the meaning of that word. Josiah, I did some digging and I found out the IPC again has much longer name. It's an agency in the United Nations that tracks famine around the world. There are actually other examples of real famine. So, for instance, in Somalia, there was a really bad famine over the last 10 years, and also in Sudan. And the numbers in
Mhm.
Somalia are terrifying. 258,000 deaths in during a period there of famine in Somalia. That's more than a quarter of a million people dead because of famine. That is so. That's what we're talking about, folks. It's this is what famine is. It's I actually think
Yeah.
the number that they use is like 2 people dying per every 10,000 every day. So for every 10,000 people, if 2 people are dying per day, um, that is a famine. So in this context, clearly that's not happening. And Samantha Power became I'm gonna call her the technocrat that cried wolf. They start using these terms that are not true, and then it cheapens the thing. I want to say this to our Christian listeners, to our alumni listening. Christians respond to truth, not theater. We don't need to exaggerate things in order to care about them. Exaggerate tragedy. This is a real concerning situation. You know, about 2 million people in Gaza having food insecurity is a real deal, but we don't need to go around lying like these people have uh, in order to make us care. So let's talk about. So that's what happened. That last
Yeah.
year, the report they said there was famine, a projection that was not real. Let's talk about today. So, how would you, Josiah, realistically describe the humanitarian conditions in Gaza today?
Yeah. I mean, it's a really good point you made that there are real issues that Christians should care about, and we don't have to lie or exaggerate in order to understand that there's problems that do need to be addressed. So, first thing I would say is there's some really good reporting if you're curious on some of what Sebastian and I just shared about this debate over the term a famine, that sort of thing, and why people are using it incorrectly. The Free Press put out an article which is really good. We'll put it in the show notes so you can read it if you want to learn more about that. In terms of what's actually happening in Gaza, I think it's better to say that it's very poor. It's true that there is food insecurity. It means that while there is enough food in Gaza to feed everyone, it is challenging to access the food. It's not like people can easily access food or store food or things like that, especially because there's a very high degree of displacement in the Gaza Strip. So that's a real concern, and we don't need to exaggerate numbers in order to point out the fact that just because there's enough food doesn't mean that it's easy to actually get, store, and eat the food. You also have to keep in mind there's some real concerns that are caused by the the conditions of war in the Gaza Strip, which are necessarily going to require a lot of the food that's sent into Gaza to be non-perishable items as opposed to perishable items. What does that mean? Well, it means that the quality of food available, again, there's enough of it, but it doesn't mean that it's necessarily good food or that it's extremely healthy food. You're going to be eating a lot more flour, beans, rice, that sort of food staples as opposed to quality, high quality fresh produce, that kind of thing, because of the nature of how food has to be moved and how long it has to be stored in order to distribute humanitarian aid. So there's real problems. It's not like the situation in the Gaza Strip is good by any means. It's just that it doesn't necessarily reach the level of a famine. I would say that the last the last thing that is important to note about the conditions in the Gaza Strip is that a lot of the debate right now that's happening, if you take a look at the different arrangements that are being made right now, as Israel starts to allow humanitarian aid back into the Gaza Strip, they're working with the U.S., they're working with the UN, and trying to figure out how are they going to coordinate the distribution of the humanitarian aid that is re-entering the Gaza Strip. And a lot of the debate is not how much or how many trucks should be allowed through the crossings. It's how do you distribute it once it gets into the Gaza Strip? Whose responsibility is it? Is it Israel's? Is it the UN's? Is it a third party like the United States that steps up to help and make sure that it gets distributed effectively? Because again, one of the consequences of the high level of displacement of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip is the difficulty of determining how to get food to them safely without having to go through different areas in which fighting is happening, or without having to allow Hamas to be a part of the distribution mechanism, because it's at this point very well documented that when Hamas winds up in the middle of the supply chain somehow and has any role in distribution, that they will siphon some of it for their own purposes. They will resell it to Palestinians and price gouge in order to make a profit and support their ongoing operations. There are also organized criminal elements that will do the same thing. So there's problems. I think it is important that we take a step back and we just give a very blunt, frank assessment that is not good in the Gaza Strip. Just because there's a lot of food doesn't mean it's easy to get your hands on it. At the same time, again, we need to be speaking the truth rather than engaging in these exaggerations.
Yeah, and if the audience wants to look this up, you can find videos on social media on YouTube about uh like there are videos where aid is coming into the strip and people are trying to get aid, and then these gangsters will come in a truck, steal the food and run away, and like and that's what has led a lot of Palestinians to come out and protest against Hamas, because there's video evidence of Hamas stealing food from their own people. So like you said, you know, a lot of food, a lot of aid has come in. The accusations of starvation are not accurate, but however, we do have to recognize that it's a terrible situation. People are having food insecurity. There's basically no agriculture in Gaza right now, and people moving
Yeah.
from north to south right now. That's what they're doing, right? They're moving from north to south.
At the moment, yeah, a
Yeah.
lot of what's happening is the IDF has sealed off the southernmost portion of the Gaza Strip, and it's almost like a pincer movement where you do have the IDF holding a line in the south that they don't want anyone crossing. And then you have the IDF also operating in the north and asking people to evacuate further south, really towards the middle. And what they're trying to do in essence is do a much more effective job than they have in the past of separating civilians from Hamas so that they can more thoroughly eradicate Hamas than they have in the past when they've kind of just engaged in this catch and release policy where they go into parts of Gaza, then they leave, and then Hamas comes back, and then they go back in after Hamas. And at some point, you have to like permanently separate the civilians from Hamas in order to actually destroy Hamas. And that's part of what's going on right now. But to your point, Sebastian, yeah, there's a lot of evacuations, and it means that people are being moved around a lot.
Right. And the one last thing we would say about this is that just because there's food doesn't mean that people are eating well. So we do have to care and pray for this. That here's what the Christian call to action would be, I think. We need to pray that enough pressure we put on Hamas to end this war, to release the hostages. If people really care about Palestinian suffering, they would put pressure on Hamas and its sponsors like Qatar and Turkey. some leaders of Qatar of Hamas are living in luxury hotels, eating the best food they can eat in Qatar, in Doha, or in Turkey, while their people are starving. And if they want to stop the suffering of Palestinians, they can just ask Hamas to give up the hostages. The war ends. Food will start coming in. People will start trying to rebuild their lives, which we will talk about this at the end of our episode today. What would rebuilding
Mm.
look like? But
Yeah.
one last thing I'll say about this, Josiah. So we saw that Israel last week when Trump was in the region, Israel went back to put pressure on Hamas. Right? They were doing operations. They're launched this new operation, which we'll talk about it. And I
Hmm.
just wanted to make a little comment about last week. We don't see the American administration criticizing Israel strongly or telling them to stop. Like even though the aid situation is bad, I heard comments from Secretary Rubio, for instance, saying like, "Yeah, it's good that aid is coming in. Aid needs to come in," but they're not saying anything like they're not asking Israel to stop outright, right? Like a change has happened in the American administration's uh, communication with Israel to let them carry out this operation. Any thoughts about that before we transition?
There's been people arguing both sides of this. Some people citing anonymous sources saying that the White House wants the war to end, others saying that the White House is saying that they have given Israel freedom to continue the operation in Gaza and destroy Hamas. I think if you look at the actions of the administration, they're going to be probably more insightful or informative than these anonymous sources are, generally speaking. And to this point, no, the US has not done anything to restrain Israel's ability to pursue a more intense operation in the Gaza Strip. In fact, it has observed, as Israel said for weeks, we're about to start a more intensive operation. And then they did. In the last week, Israel started their Chariots of Gideon operation in the Gaza Strip. That's a much more intensive ground operation. And the US didn't do anything to stop it. So I think actions do
Right.
speak louder than words.
Yeah.
The point about Marco Rubio, though, I do want to make a
Go
note
ahead.
real quick. Why would he say something like it's time? It makes sense. If you're looking at March 2nd being the last time that humanitarian aid entered the Gaza Strip, and that was supposed to be a 3 to 6 month supply of food. End of May, it's been almost 3 months. So it makes sense that now is when the US administration would say, okay, it's time to let a little bit more humanitarian aid in because that supply is going to run out sometime in the next couple of months.
Right.
So
Also,
I don't find that that doesn't seem to me to be a signal that the US is upset with Israel, just recognizing the reality of the situation is like, it's time for more humanitarian aid.
right. Yeah. Fun fact: Marco Rubio technically has the office that Samantha Power had last year. Right. She was charge of U.S. ID. What is it? U.S. And
U.S.
technically,
Agency for
that's
International Development. Yeah, it
right.
was recently basically folded into the Department of State as part of various reorganizations earlier this year. Yeah.
So he technically has that portfolio as well, talking about aid. But all right.
Yep.
You mentioned the name of the operation. It's called Gideon's Chariots. So we invite the audience to go and find out more about Gideon. This is the guy that sponsors the Bibles that you find on your hotel rooms. Just kidding. It's from the Bible. Judges 7 and
Yeah.
8. Gideon, the chariots. By the way, this whole operation since the beginning has been called Swords of Iron, right? So now this particular operation is called Gideon's Chariots. Um, so as Israel is taking more territory and they want to hold it, we talked about this last week. They don't want to raid and then move on. They want to hold territory. That will give them more responsibility for things like humanitarian aid, like we're talking about. Um, the alternative to this would be a ceasefire. But let me ask you, what do you think might happen next? I'm asking you to predict the future.
Oy, I don't love predicting the future. That's always a really dangerous game to play. It
You're not a
it seems
prophet,
like
but you do work for a nonprofit organization. Sorry, go ahead.
uh, but good one. I I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question precisely. I think there's a couple of scenarios that are realistic and feasible. So maybe we'll just kind of break some of those down. The solutions forward, if you consider this to be a sort of a fork in the road, there's some possible options that we might see unfold. One being that Israel pursues this operation in the Gaza Strip to the end of what they would like to see, which is the end of Hamas in the Gaza Strip and the return of the hostages. In that case, it would make sense that they are currently trying to figure out with the US and the UN a better distribution mechanism for humanitarian aid. Because if Israel does pursue the war that far, they would assume, presumably, more responsibility for the humanitarian conditions of the Gaza Strip because the government of Gaza would no longer exist. So it makes sense that that's something Israel is aware of. That is a possibility, a hypothetical scenario that could unfold in which they need to be prepared for. Another scenario is that there is a ceasefire deal instead, and that Hamas stays in power. And of course, there's a lot of debate about what would that look like. Would they be required to disarm or not? How long would that ceasefire be? Would it be a few months or a few years? A lot that I think still needs to be sorted out in the negotiations. But if a ceasefire is reached, then again, Israel would not have as much responsibility to distribute humanitarian aid, but would, I think, have an interest in how it's being distributed so that Hamas doesn't use it to sort of rearm itself or grow too strong again in the future. So those are a couple of different options that Israel has to be thinking about right now. Either you win the war or you adopt anywhere from a short to long-term ceasefire and have to figure out how to sort of contain Hamas in the meantime so that it doesn't grow too strong. One signal I think that is very interesting that could potentially change things. Last week we argued didn't seem very likely that a ceasefire was on the horizon, even after the release of Idan Alexander. Something that followed fairly shortly after, though, that was very interesting is that Israel killed Muhammad Sinwar, who was a Hamas official, younger brother of the older brother Sinwar, Yahya, and someone who took over not just the military leadership of Hamas in Gaza after the previous military leader was killed, Mohammed Def, but also took over really leadership of Hamas in Gaza as a whole after his older brother died, and someone who has been extraordinarily hard to work with when it comes to negotiating these hostage deals and ceasefires. He's very opposed to any sort of ceasefire with Israel that does not meet all of Hamas's demands. So if he's dead now, which it seems like he is, the news reports suggest that they've confirmed that he was actually killed in a strike last week. Maybe it's possible that a ceasefire could be reached sometime in the next few weeks. Maybe you've taken a piece off the board that was an obstacle, and if new people can now sit at the table, maybe negotiations can move forward. Who knows? I still feel like it's a little too early to be predicting the future, but those are some of the scenarios I think that Israel does need to be prepared for.
Right. Sorry, remind me. The strike on Sinwar happened before or after the Ed and Alexander release?
After.
After.
Yep.
Okay. So this is super interesting. So Israel, I mean, the United States was able to reach a deal for one American, and immediately after, Israel goes and kills the guy in charge right now. That again, that tells you that Israel has a lot more freedom to act right now, and America is letting them pursue the war.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this guy, Mohammed Sinwar, brother of Yahya Sinwar. You all remember that video, Yahya Sinwar dying alone in a rubbled a building, throwing a stick at a drone that the building eventually collapsed on top of him. This his brother Mohammed has been killed allegedly. We don't know if he's dead, but we don't know if he's alive. So we'll wait. I saw
I
the
think at this
picture.
point they think that they've confirmed they found his body in the tunnel.
Oh,
So
okay,
I would say with a fair degree of certainty,
okay.
it seems as if he was killed in the strike. Yeah.
I saw pictures of the craters left by some of these operation. It's huge, like a bus
Yeah.
was falling through one of these holes. So he took over Hamas after his brother died. I want to
Hmm.
take a pause here, or his brother was killed. I just wanted to highlight on the suffering that these people have brought to their families. Both of these guys, like their entire families, have been killed. I think. Like if you look at the extent, like let's talk about their mother, right? The mother of Yakia and Mohammed Sinwar. I don't know what this woman's name is, but look at the suffering that this ideology brings to families. Entire families wiped out, entire generations wiped out because of their hatred, because of this sickness, this death cult that is uh, jihad, right? It's what do you say about that, real quick, before we keep going?
You know, it's really very tragic. I think there are examples of various Hamas officials who have lost family members as a result of the fighting. Ismail Khania also lost some family members before he was killed in Tehran last year. The the thing about Hamas that I think that makes it so particularly dangerous in many ways is that it is an acceptable loss to a certain degree. So there was another official earlier this week who was giving some press conference, I think, or an interview of some kind. He was on television, and he was asked essentially about this question: how many people need to die, or something along those lines. And his answer essentially was that it is a objective calculation that these deaths are necessary in order to advance the cause. And this is something that you've been hearing from Hamas officials really since the beginning of the war, even before the death toll really started to rise significantly in the Gaza Strip. They were already arguing it doesn't matter how many Palestinians die. All that matters is that we achieve our objective, which is the creation of a Palestinian state and the destruction of Israel. It's not just that they want a state; they also want to destroy Israel in order to achieve it. And it doesn't necessarily matter how many people die in the process. In fact, it's not just something that they're willing to justify, but perhaps even glorify. They'll venerate these people who have died as having died for the cause, even in situations where they didn't necessarily need to, except for the fact that Hamas started this massive war.
Yeah.
So it's really unfortunate, I think, the way that Hamas just uses its people in order to achieve its aims, and then tries to spin things by honoring them and glorifying the fact that they've died, when in reality they didn't have a choice. When Hamas started this war against Israel, they chose to send these people to their deaths willingly.
Yeah, and this is a prayer point for us Christians, guys who are listening, alumni. We gotta pray that the Lord will break this stronghold of the cult of death that Hamas promotes. They love
Mm.
death. Death is part of their strategy, and that's terrible. These people are deceived. They truly believe, apparently, right? What they say is like, if they die for jihad, if they die in holy war, they will get all these rewards in supposed heaven. But we know that's not true. The Bible, we know what the Bible says. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And these people are killing themselves, are killing their people for a false cult that is destroying them. We need to pray that the Lord will bring spiritual freedom and the gospel, honestly, to end this tragic death cult. But all right, tell us more about the details. So this guy, Mohammed, was killed in a strike. Any other details you'd like to mention how this was carried out?
Yeah, are you familiar, Sebastian, with some of the stories about the different hospitals that have been struck or attacked over the last year and a half?
The only thing that comes to memory is like the big scandal at the beginning of the war when a rocket hit a hospital and it was supposed to be Israeli, but actually it was Palestinian Islamic Jihad. But tell us about the
Yeah.
hospitals. I was impressed by the number of hospitals in Gaza, by the way. I thought it was like one or two. There are more than that.
No, there's quite a few. It's a very, I should say, was a very robust healthcare system. Of course, a lot of damage has been done during the war, but what's been really fascinating to observe is the dialogue or the public discourse about the role that hospitals play in the Gaza Strip as a part of the environment in which this war is being fought. And the reason I bring this up is because Muhammad Sinwar was hiding in a tunnel system underneath the European hospital in the Gaza Strip. So the underground system underneath the hospital is what the Israeli forces bombed essentially in order to kill Muhammad Sinwar. And it's not the first time that that's happened, that Israel has either taken troops to different hospitals or has even bombed facilities adjacent to various hospitals in the Gaza Strip, or that some hospitals have experienced some damage either in the hospital or very close by because the war is being fought around them. And usually what happens is that the headlines will say something like, Israel bombs hospital, and there's not a lot of context. People don't understand why is Israel bombing a hospital. But what has come up time and time again throughout the war is that there's usually a more complicated picture that's not being shared or not being shown. So you have cases early in the war, for example, when hostages were being held inside hospitals in Gaza City, or examples where it was alleged, in some cases proven, other cases alleged, that different hospital staff were actually members, not just members, maybe even officers of Hamas's military wing, or cases in which Hamas officials were hiding underneath hospitals, like Muhammad Sinwar was, or where weapons were being hidden within, stored within hospitals, or in which Hamas was actively shooting at IDF troops from inside a hospital. So these these are all very complicated pictures that unfortunately are not often shown when the headlines just scream something like Israel bombs hospital. But what comes up quite often is this conversation about international law, and people will make the statement, international law protects health workers and healthcare facilities like hospitals. They are not legitimate targets during armed conflict, things of that nature. And they'll cite the Geneva Conventions, usually something like that. And generally speaking, those arguments are true. But I think what we need to consider when we think about how to react to some of these headlines about where someone like Mohammed Sinwar is killed if it's underneath the hospital. While it is generally true that a hospital or a health facility or health worker is not a legitimate military target,
Right.
the
When
Geneva
do they
Conventions will
become?
also state that can change. Yeah, it's possible for them to become a legitimate military target if they're being used for a military purpose, if they're hiding troops, if they're hiding weapons, if someone is
Okay.
actively shooting at you from a hospital,
Sorry.
it
Say it
loses its
louder for the
protected
people in the
status.
back. Once again, when does a hospital become a legitimate military target?
If it's being used for military purposes. So if you're hiding weapons, hiding hostages, hiding military officials, or especially if you're actively shooting from within a hospital, it no longer has a protected status under international law. It becomes an environment in which one party has already introduced conflict, so therefore the other party has the right to engage in conflict. In this case, because Hamas is the one hiding inside the hospital or hiding weapons or shooting from within the hospitals, Israel has, under international law, the same international laws that protect hospitals, Israel has the right to engage and to, within reason, try to fight within the confines of those spaces in order to carry out their military objectives.
Wow. Wait, so real quick, has America done this in Baghdad or in Afghanistan in World War II? Is there a history of hospitals being targeted by democracies like the Allies or America?
That's a really good question. I think in the context of recent wars, yes, there have been some cases.
Okay.
I'm going to be honest, my World War II history is not that specific.
Right, right, right.
I'm not familiar enough that I want to speak with
I
certainty
know I'm
as if
catching
I'm
you
an
totally off
expert on
guard,
that.
but I wonder, like, in the war against terror in Iraq or Afghanistan, I wonder
Yeah,
if America has
absolutely,
targeted
absolutely.
hospitals.
I mean, just think about a common example that comes up a lot that people reference as sort of an analogy or a parallel to consider in terms of what does conflict look like when you're fighting a terror organization in a densely populated urban center. One of the most frequently used analogies is Mosul
Right.
in Iraq when it was liberated from ISIS. If you look at the pictures, I mean, they had to flatten the entire city.
Mm.
It was absolute devastation. But that was what the coalition deemed necessary, the Western coalition deemed necessary in order to defeat this terror organization that was trying to create an Islamic caliphate in the Middle East. So there are other instances in which it's not just Israel that does this, that has to fight these wars in urban centers and has to, unfortunately, fight in very close quarters, and a lot of damage is done as a result. Israel just happens to be the one doing it, right now.
Right. Well, yeah, I bet this is probably going to be a surprise to a lot of people who are hearing this, that hospitals can become legitimate military targets if, like you said, if terrorists are operating within it. Let us know if you knew this in the comments, guys, listeners. Do you do you know this? Do you have any other questions for Josiah about rules of engagement? Please ask us. What about schools? What about houses with children in it, with family members? I think these are all really good questions to ask because going back to episode one, this is one of the things that changed my mind about Israel. The rules of
Mm.
engagement, which are higher than other countries, and that changed my life. Realizing the rules that by which Israel subjects itself, its own army. So tell us in the comments if you have any questions for Josiah about rules of engagement. Um, so one last thing, since the killing of this terrorist, Muhammad Sinwar, might bring up questions for Christians. Is it right to kill evil people? What happened? Should we rejoice when evil people are killed? Well, in the podcast notes, we will include a live that we did about this with a friend of ours. So we will give you resources for you to think about this. And of course, you can ask us questions in the comments, and Josiah and I will tackle that. Okay. Any last thoughts before we move to the next subject of the day?
No, I definitely would encourage watching that Instagram live if you have time, though, because it's not a black and white issue in terms of whether you celebrate the death of another person, no matter how evil they are. I think there is, of course, cause to rejoice in seeing justice done, but it is a human soul that has been lost. So I think it's worth pausing and reflecting on that if you have the time, and the link will be in the show notes.
Thank you. Yeah. And this is the beauty of this podcast. The Passages Pulse is a podcast done by Christians to think like Christians about this issue. So complicates things, but that's what God wants us to do. What would Jesus
Mm.
do? Think better about it. All right. Let's think for a moment that a ceasefire could be reached. Honestly, last Tuesday, I was very optimistic. Like, all right, Witkoff, do your thing. Let's see if we can reach a ceasefire deal. Doesn't seem that way right now. Let me ask you some 4 quick questions about this, and we'll start talking about this issue.
Sure.
People like President Trump famously have suggested that what if we try to find a way for Gazans to migrate out of this area because the areas in rubbles, like it's not it's not a livable space. What do you know about Gazans? Are what Gazans willing to emigrate somewhere else after a ceasefire?
Yes and no. So, I mean, there's a fairly even split. Somewhere a little less than half, I think, would suggest that they are willing to emigrate if given the option to do so. They maybe slightly fewer number would say that they trust Israel to facilitate that process, but if someone else facilitated, maybe some would be willing to immigrate. It's a complicated question, but I do think you're seeing some more data come out suggesting that there are a significant number of people living in the Gaza Strip who would be willing to immigrate if given the choice to escape the suffering. I think that the most recent data is coming out of the Palestinian Center for Survey and Policy Research, the polling that they do.
Where is
So,
that based?
well, they're based in Ramallah.
Okay.
It's a Palestinian
So it's
polling
Palestinians polling
and survey firm.
Palestinians. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, they do good work. There's been some well, quite a history, I would say, of polling that they've done since long before October 7, but especially since October 7. Every few months or so, they do a new survey to track different opinions and whatnot. So we'll put a link in the show notes for that as well. Their latest report, because there's some interesting stuff in there.
Okay. So almost half, close to half of people are willing to immigrate. Second questions, the issue of Hamas being in power or not. If somehow Hamas were to not be in power anymore after this, which is what Israel wants to see, right? This is one of the objectives
Mm,
of the war, to remove Hamas from power.
right.
Who would Palestinians like to see in power, of the Palestinian Authority or the Palestinian people? What are they saying in these polls?
Well, if you consider only the current Palestinian Authority leadership, Mahmoud Abbas and Hamas, Hamas would still be more popular.
Hmm,
The Palestinian Authority is deeply unpopular because it's viewed as very old,
that's so
out of
crazy.
touch, corrupt, ineffective. I mean, yeah, it just has extremely low popularity ratings. So the Palestinian Authority probably, I should say, Mahmoud Abbas specifically, if you were to pick a name to put on the ballot next to Hamas, Mahmoud Abbas would probably struggle to beat Hamas in an election. What's interesting is that there are rivals of Mahmoud Abbas within the Fatah party who are more popular and could beat Hamas in an election. The person who gets the most support in polls right now, his name is Marwan Barghouti. He's a Fatah member who's currently in an Israeli prison for activity during the Second Intifada, but he is someone who is deeply popular and more popular than Mahmoud Abbas. So popular, in fact, that Hamas has, over the years, during various prisoner exchanges, tried to negotiate for his release, even though
Hmm.
he's not a member of Hamas, because Hamas knows that he could he could defeat Mahmoud Abbas relatively easily and take control of the Fatah party if he were not in Israeli prison.
That's so interesting. Of course, I assume that Palestinians, when they're asked about this, they're thinking about how much they hate Abbas, Abu Mazen, as he's called, and they're like living under the corrupt Palestinian Authority. But like, do they not see what Hamas has done to their people in Gaza? Like, do they want to live under that type of people? The people who protect their guns using people. Israel uses guns to protect its people. Hamas uses their people to protect their guns. Uh, so they want to bring the suffering to themselves. Uh, okay, let me ask you another question before a quick story. I remember going to do an event in Ottawa, Canada one day. I was with a student, a Christian student. We're going to do an event, and our Uber driver happened to be Palestinian, so we started talking about this issue, and he told me that he likes some Hamas, that he support Hamas, and that Hamas is the solution to the Palestinian conflict. And I could not believe hearing that for the first time. Like 8 years ago, probably. I just never met somebody who would tell me to my face, I think the terrorist organization Hamas is the solution. But
Mm.
a lot of Palestinians reportedly seem to be saying this. So let me ask you, support for October 7th among Palestinians, how many of them allegedly or reportedly support what Hamas did on October 7th?
I mean, this is one of the most complicated questions or issues that the polling data has been trying to understand for the last year and a half, and it's far from, I think, a black and white issue. So I'll try to explain. For starters, just to get this out there first, about 50% of Palestinians say that they support October 7th still. That number has gone down over the course of the war, but it's still about 50% of Palestinians that say that they support October 7th. Now, the flip side, and this is where things get really tricky and kind of hard to understand, if you ask people, what do you support about October 7th? Or why do you support October 7th? And you ask them some more specific questions like, do you believe that Hamas committed atrocities, especially against civilians on October 7th? Something like 90% of Palestinians are going to say no. They don't think that Hamas committed any atrocities against civilians on October 7th.
That's so interesting.
And they wouldn't support October 7th if Hamas had done those things. So
Because if you ask
you're in
them,
this.
do you believe that Israel has committed atrocities? They will probably say yes. But if you're asking Hamas has committed atrocities, 90% say no.
Right. Yeah. You got 90% say no. And I think what's so fascinating about that, the more you dig into the data, you find that there's a really serious public information and education problem in Palestinian society because the rest of the world on October 7th, I mean the day of and the weeks following, were well aware of what happened because it was live streamed. There were videos, there were photos. It was all over social media. You couldn't miss it. It was all over the news in the United States. I mean, every major news network was showing footage for weeks of what had happened on October 7th. But in Palestinian society, they're going to argue, most Palestinians, that they've never seen any evidence of what happened on October 7th. They haven't seen the videos or the proof of what Hamas actually did on October 7th. And if you ask yourself, well, how is that possible that the rest of the world knows
Right.
the
They
truth
live
about what
streamed it. They
happened
posted on Telegram.
and you don't? Yeah. What it seems like it comes down to, there's two things that seem to be sort of behind this gap in terms of how we understand reality and the truth about October 7th. The first is that there's a pretty clear indication that what was shared on social media to the West was not necessarily shared within Palestinian circles or society at large, at least, maybe in some circles, but not the entirety of Palestinian society. And second, most Palestinians are going to report that they get their news about current events or their confirmation about current events from a source like cable television. If you look at both the Palestinian Center survey as well as the Arab Barometer surveys that are done by another party, you'll find that what that translates to essentially is, cable television, Al Jazeera. Like, most Palestinians are getting their news about current events from a source like Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera, as has become much more clear recently, is basically a propaganda tool of
Whoa.
Hamas.
Love to hear you say that.
And the
Because
way
last
that
time
Hamas
you
has
were
been
very
using
kind to
it,
them. You were like, they are problematic or
I
something.
was
And I was like,
I was yeah, I was trying to be kind, but the reality is, like, just look at the numbers of incidents that you've seen connecting Al Jazeera in some way to Hamas. You have documentaries produced by Al Jazeera. You have, I think we did reference this last week, the role that they played in producing and broadcasting or promoting the hostage release ceremonies,
exactly.
which were just
The production
absolutely
company
grotesque.
behind them. Yeah.
Yeah, it was horrifying, grotesque ceremonies, but Al Jazeera was helping them
Exactly.
put
The
this
production
together.
company
You have
behind them. Yeah.
many incidents in which Al Jazeera reporters are embedded inside Hamas and are later accused of either being with Hamas on October 7 to help document what happened and tell the story the way Hamas wanted it to be told, or are some people who are, you know, it goes even a step further. They're accused of actually being terrorists, of having carried out violence, not just being journalists.
Right.
So at this point, I mean, there's enough evidence, you put two and two together, and it seems like there's a mutually beneficial relationship between Hamas and Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera gets good stories, Hamas gets stories told the way they want them to be told. And unfortunately, the people who lose out in this scenario are both Palestinians and Israelis, because Palestinians are severely underinformed or misinformed about what happened on October 7 and what Hamas did on October 7. And Israelis are left without someone on the other side to try to negotiate and put the pieces back together who actually knows what happened.
Exactly.
Both sides lose in the scenario. The only people who really win are Hamas, unfortunately, because so many Palestinians just don't understand what actually happened.
This is such an important point. When I talk about the conflict, I always bring up this issue that I'll throw it back to you. I wonder what you think about this. If you go back to 1940s, Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, the leader of the Arabs in pre-state Palestine, pre-Israel,
Yeah.
he knew history. He knew who he was. He knew the history of the land. He knew that there had never been a Palestinian state, that this is just kind of a bunch of Arab people who started calling themselves Palestinians as a people in the 60s, probably. Same thing for Yasser Arafat, Egyptian guy, born in Egypt, who also knew history. He knew, and he was the guy who was negotiating peace with Israel in the 80s, in the 90s. So these people knew history. The problem with the people of the Palestinian territories today, and this is a prayer point for our audience, they don't know any better a lot of times. They have been brainwashed in these schools. They have been told a version of history, and they will be very surprised to hear, like you, Josiah, teach a history of the Palestinian conflict, because they have been brainwashed. So it's really difficult for Israel to find a peace partner with them. You just laid out that among these people, allegedly, 50% of them support October 7, 90% of them deny that Hamas committed atrocities against civilians. They watch Al Jazeera, little bunny trail on Al Jazeera. one of the big reasons why I hated Israel was AJ Plus. AJ Plus is one of their social media accounts. I don't know if it's still out
Mm.
there, that would make these mini documentaries about Israel that will make you hate Israel. AJ Plus was doing this while hiding the fact that, so they were appealing to liberal Americans, like I was in college, while uh, hiding the fact that Qatar was using slaves to build these World Cup stadiums. In Qatar, I don't know if still today, it was is illegal, punishable by death, to be a homosexual. While these people appeal to liberals in the United States. So, anyways, this is the problem of Israel not having a partner for peace. We gotta wrap it up soon, but let's end our podcast talking about this. What do you say about that? Like, this is a tragedy that Israel does not have a partner for peace right now. A lot of people in the world want Israel to have a two-state solution. I don't know if Palestinians want that.
I I think it's a very difficult reality, a tough pill to swallow, that a two-state solution is much further away than it was prior to October 7th. There are a lot of people, I think, whose natural reaction to something as horrifying as October 7 is to say, we have to do something to prevent this from happening again. We have to make a two-state solution so that we can be done with this, so that we never have to suffer this kind of tragedy again, so that Israelis and Palestinians no longer have to suffer violence and those sorts of things. And on the one hand, that sounds really nice, and it is a very, idealistic view of the conflict that we would all like to have. I tend to be a little bit more of a realist or a skeptic, depending on the term you want to use. And I think the reality is that what happened on October 7 is not going to motivate peace to happen faster. It's actually going to make it much more difficult, because now you have an extraordinary level of distrust above and beyond what already existed between Israelis and Palestinians. And you don't have, I don't think, a strong sense that either side is eager or even willing to sit down and negotiate the terms of a permanent two-state solution right now. The reality is it could be years before that becomes something that is feasible. It doesn't mean that it has to take that long, but it very well could be a long time before there's a more permanent solution to this conflict, because you can't negotiate in the middle of a trust deficit that is as deep as what Israelis and Palestinians are experiencing right now, especially when you're not on the same page about basic facts, like did Hamas commit atrocities or not. And if there is that perception gap of reality and that strong sense of distrust in each other, I don't see there being a realistic path forward to a permanent peace between the two sides in the near future.
Yeah, and that's a tragedy. Like I said, a lot of people around the world make this litmus test. Do you support a two-state solution? And a lot of people do, but not enough Palestinian leaders do. They have been offered a lot of different deals, and we know we're not going to dive into that right now, but they have always rejected any kind of deal, because for a lot of Palestinian leaders, it's all or nothing. They want to see Israel gone from the river to the sea. That's their chant. So let me say one last thing about this. One of the concerning things I've seen in the last year is countries around the world making unilateral recognitions of the state of Palestine um, after October 7th. So what they see in this internal politics of these countries is that Palestinians are suffering, they're under war, and they see that and they say, well, we are just going to punish Israel by recognizing the Palestinian state unilateral. Y'all, we got to pray about this. This is really bad, because what this does is that it sends a message to Palestinian people that this is how you get your statehood recognized, through terrorism. So October 7th, like more than 2,000 terrorists come into Israel, kill more than 1,200 people. And the reaction to that, the worst slaughter of Jewish people since the Holocaust from some of these countries, is to recognize a Palestinian state, to reward them, which incentivizes more terror. What kind of message, I'm asking to the people rhetorically, what kind of message does that send? I have a little list here. Countries that have recognized a Palestinian state in the last year. A lot of this happened last summer. Norway, Spain, Ireland, Slovenia, Armenia, Jamaica, Mexico, which has a Jewish president, has recognized Israel, a Palestinian state in the last few months as well. So, to the audience, think about this. What kind of message do you think that sends? So we gotta pray. Here's my last prayer point. We gotta pray for better Palestinian leaders. We want to see this conflict have a resolution. We want to see people just not suffer anymore. But Palestinian people need better leaders. They need less Yahya Sinwars, less Muhammad Sinwars, Israel Hania. We need to pray for them to raise better leaders who will embrace peace and not a death cult. Let me send you to the last thought, Josiah. What's your last thought about this?
I don't think I could say anything better than that, Sebastian. I think the importance of praying for leaders who want to make peace, leaders who have courage, is a good thing for us to be praying for. So I think closing there that's good.
Yeah, thank you so much for your work today, brother. Praying for you, for your wife. Hopefully, maybe next week we'll be talking about baby number 3 in the McGee family. If not, we'll see you again.
Sounds good.
All right.
Thank you, Sebastian.
Thanks for listening and watching. Let us know in the comments. Share this with your friends, with your church friends. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you for watching and listening. We'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Passages Pulse. Help us grow this community by liking, sharing, and subscribing. If you like this week's episode, let us know by leaving a comment below. This podcast is a project of Passages Israel. We exist to educate the next generation of Christians on modern Israel, deepen the roots of their faith, and equip leaders to foster positive Christian engagement with Israel and the Jewish people. To learn more about Passages, follow us on social media or visit us at passagesisrael.org. Until next time, we'll keep our finger on the pulse.